Christ was born on Christmas Day. Wreath the holly, twine the bay. Christus natus hodie, the babe, the Son, the Holy One of Mary. He is born to set us free. He is born our Lord to be. Ex Maria Virgine, the God, the Lord, by all adored forever.
Welcome to the 9th day of CraftLit. Today, for our CraftLit Christmas compilation, you will hear a Christmas inspiration, a Christmas mistake, It Came Upon a Midnight Clear, Christmas Greetings from 1867, Christmas Day from 1809, Christmas Bearing Out, Christmas in the Olden Time, 1861, Christmas Time, Old Christmas, Children's Book of Christmas Stories, Christmas in 1776, and followed up by Christmas on Wheels, Christmas and the Literature of Disillusion, Barney's Tale of the Wee Red Cap. If you haven't listened to the day one, the first day of CraftLit, you may want to go do that. All of the information on how and where to find other episodes will be in that opening. However, the short version is, if you're watching/listening on YouTube, you can get the playlist on our YouTube channel. And if you are looking at show notes and listening to this as an actual audio podcast, if you look in the show notes, you will see not only links to all the previous episodes, but time codes telling you where to fast wind to or rewind to be able to listen to exactly the right story that you want to listen to. All right, here we go.
Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1896 to 1901, by Lucy Maud Montgomery, A Christmas Inspiration. "Well, I really think Santa Claus has been very good to us all," said Jean Lawrence, pulling the pins out of her heavy coil of fair hair and letting it ripple over her shoulders. "So do I," said Nellie Preston, as well as she could with a mouthful of chocolates. "Those blessed home folks of mine seem to have divined by instinct the very things I most wanted." It was the dusk of Christmas Eve, and they were all in Jean Lawrence's room at number 16 Chestnut Terrace. Number 16 was a boarding house, and boarding houses are not proverbially cheerful places in which to spend Christmas, but Jean's room, at least, was a pleasant spot, and all the girls had brought their Christmas presents in to show each other. Christmas came on Sunday that year, and the Saturday evening mail at Chestnut Terrace had been an exciting one. Jean had lighted the pink-globed lamp on her table, and the mellow light fell over merry faces as the girls chatted about their gifts. On the table was a big white box heaped with roses that betokened a bit of Christmas extravagance on somebody's part. Jean's brother had sent them to her from Montreal, and all the girls were enjoying them in common. Number 16 Chestnut Terrace was overrun with girls generally, but just now only 5 were left. All the others had gone home for Christmas. But these 5 could not go, and were bent on making the best of it. Belle and Olive Reynolds, who were sitting on the bed, Jean could never keep them off of it, were high school girls. They were said to be always laughing, and even the fact that they could not go home for Christmas because a young brother had measles did not dampen their spirits. Beth Hamilton, who was hovering over the roses, and Nellie Peterson, who was eating candy, were art students, and their homes were too far away to visit. As for Jean Lawrence, she was an orphan and had no home of her own. She worked on the staff of one of the big city newspapers, and the other girls were a little in awe of her cleverness, but her nature was a chummy one, and her room was a favorite rendezvous. Everybody liked frank, open-handed, and hearted Jean. "It was so funny to see the postman when he came this evening," said Olive. "He just bulged with parcels. They were sticking out in every direction." "We all got our share of them," said Jean with a sigh of contentment. "Even the cook got 6. I counted." "Miss Ellen didn't get a thing, not even a letter," said Beth quickly. Beth had a trick of seeing things that the other girls didn't. "I forgot Miss Ellen. No, I don't believe she did," answered Jean thoughtfully as she twisted up her pretty hair. "How dismal it must be to be so forlorn as that on Christmas Eve of old times. Ugh, I'm so glad I have friends." "I saw Miss Allen watching us as we opened our parcels and letters," Beth went on. I happened to look up once, and such an expression as was on her face, girls! It was pathetic and sad and envious all at once. It really made me feel bad. For 5 minutes," she concluded honestly. "Hasn't Miss Allen any friends at all?" asked Beth. "No, I don't think she has," answered Jean. "She has lived here for 14 years, so Mrs. Pickerel says. Think of that, girls, 14 years at Chestnut Terrace. Is it any wonder that she's thin and dried up and snappy?" "Nobody ever comes to see her, and she never goes anywhere," said Beth. "Dear me, she must feel lonely now when everyone else is being remembered by their friends. I can't forget her face tonight. It actually haunts me. Girls, how would you feel if you hadn't anyone belonging to you, and if nobody thought about you at Christmas?" "Ow!" said Olive, as if the mere idea made her shiver. A little silence followed. To tell the truth, none of them liked Miss Allen. They knew that she did not like them either, but considered them frivolous and pert, and complained when they made a racket. The skeleton at the feast, Jean called her, and certainly the presence of the pale, silent, discontented-looking woman at number 16 table did not tend to heighten its festivity. Presently Jean said with a dramatic flourish, "Girls, I have an inspiration, a Christmas inspiration." "What is it?" cried 4 voices. "Just this. Let us give Miss Allen a Christmas surprise. She's not received a single present, and I'm sure she feels lonely. Just think how we would feel if we were in her place." "That is true," said Olive thoughtfully. "Do you know, girls, this evening I went to her room with a message from Miss Pickerel, and I do believe she'd been crying. Her room looked dreadfully bare and cheerless, too. I think she's very poor. What are we to do, Jean?" "Let us each give her something nice. We can put the things just outside of her door so that she'll see them whenever she opens it. I'll give her some of Fred's roses, too, and I'll write a Christmassy letter in my very best style to go with them," said Jean, warming up to her ideas as she talked. The other girls caught her spirit and entered into the plan with enthusiasm. "Splendid!" cried Beth. "Jean, it's an inspiration, sure enough. Haven't we been horribly selfish, thinking of nothing but our own gifts and fun and pleasure? I really feel ashamed." "Let us do up the thing the very best way we can," said Nellie, forgetting even her beloved chocolates in her eagerness. "The shops are open yet. Let us go uptown and invest." 5 minutes later 5 capped and jacketed figures were scurrying up the street in the frosty, starlit December dusk. Miss Allen, in her cold little room, heard their gay voices and sighed. She was crying by herself in the dark. It was Christmas for everybody but her, she thought drearily. In an hour the girls came back with their purchases. "Now let's hold a council of war," said Jean jubilantly. "I hadn't the faintest idea what Miss Allen would like, so I just guessed wildly. I got her a lace handkerchief and a big bottle of perfume and a painted photograph frame, and I'll stick my own photo in it for fun. That was all I really could afford. Christmas purchases have left my purse dreadfully lean." "I got her a glove box and a pin tray," said Belle. "And Olive got her a calendar and Whittier's poems, and besides we're going to give her half of that big plummy fruit cake Mother sent us from home. I'm sure she hasn't tasted anything so delicious for years, for fruit cakes don't grow on Chestnut Terrace, and she never goes anywhere else for a meal." Beth had bought a pretty cup and saucer, and said she meant to give one of her pretty watercolors, too. Nellie, true to her reputation, had invested in a big box of chocolate creams, a gorgeously striped candy cane, a bag of oranges, and a brilliant lampshade of rose-colored crepe paper to top off with. "It makes such a lot of show for the money," she explained. "I'm bankrupt, like Jean." "Well, we've got a lot of pretty things," said Jean in a tone of satisfaction. "Now we must do them up nicely. Will you wrap them in tissue paper, girls, and tie them with baby ribbon? Here's a box of it, while I write that letter." While the others chatted over their parcels, Jean wrote her letter, and Jean could write delightful letters. She had a decided talent in that respect, and her correspondents all declared her letters to be things of beauty and joy forever. She put her best into Miss Allen's Christmas letter. Since then she's written many bright and clever things, but I do not believe she's ever in her life wrote anything more genuinely original and delightful than that letter. Besides, it breathed the very spirit of Christmas, and all the girls declared that it was splendid. "You must all sign it now," said Jean, "and I'll put it in one of those big envelopes. And Nellie, won't you write her name on it in fancy letters?" Which Nellie proceeded to do, and furthermore embellished the envelope by a border of chubby cherubs dancing hand in hand around it, and a sketch of number 16 Chestnut Terrace in the corner in lieu of a stamp. Not content with this, she hunted out a huge sheet of drawing paper and drew upon it an original pen-and-ink design after her own heart, a dudish cat. Miss Allen was fond of the number 16 cat, if she could be said to be fond of anything, was portrayed seated on a rocker, arrayed in smoking jacket and cap, with a cigar waved airily aloft in one paw, while the other held out a placard bearing the legend, "Merry Christmas." A second cat in full street costume bowed politely, hat in paw, and waved a banner inscribed with "Happy New Year," while faintly suggested kittens gambolled around the border. The girls laughed until they cried over it, and voted it to be the best thing Nellie had yet done in original work. All this had taken time, and it was past 11 o'clock. Miss Allen had cried herself to sleep long ago, and everybody else in Chestnut Terrace was abed, when 5 figures cautiously crept down the hall, headed by Jean with a dim lamp. Outside of Miss Allen's door, the procession halted, and the girls silently arranged their gifts on the floor. "That's done," whispered Jean in a tone of satisfaction as they tipped back. "And now let us go to bed, or Miss Pickerel, bless her heart, will be down on us for burning so much midnight oil. Oil has gone up, you know, girls." It was in the early morning that Miss Allen opened her door. But early as it was, another door down the hall was half open too, and 5 rosy faces were peering cautiously out. The girls had been up for an hour for fear they would miss the sight, and were all in Nellie's room, which commanded a view of Miss Allen's door. That lady's face was a study. Amazement, incredulity, wonder chased each other over it, succeeded by a glow of pleasure. On the floor before her was a snug little pyramid of parcels, topped by Jean's letter. On a chair behind it was a bowl of delicious hothouse roses and Nellie's placard. Miss Allen looked down the hall, but saw nothing, for Jean had slammed the door just in time. Half an hour later, when they were going down to breakfast, Miss Allen came along down the hall with outstretched hands to meet them. She had been crying again, but I think her tears were happy ones, and she was smiling now. A cluster of Jean's roses were pinned on her breast. "Oh, girls, girls," she said, with a tremble in her voice, "I can never thank you enough. It was so kind and sweet of you. You don't know how much good you've done me." Breakfast was an unusually cheerful affair at number 16 that morning. There was no skeleton at the feast, and everybody was beaming. Miss Allen laughed and talked like a girl herself. "Oh, how surprised I was," she said. "The roses were a bit like summer, and those cats of Nellie's were so funny and delightful. And your letter, too, Jean. I cried and laughed over it. I shall read it every day for a year." After breakfast, everyone went to Christmas service. The girls went uptown to the church they attended. The city was very beautiful in the morning sunshine. There had been a white frost in the night, and the tree-lined avenues and public squares seemed like glimpses of fairyland. "How lovely the world is," said Jean. "It really is the very happiest Christmas morning I've ever known," declared Nellie. "I never felt so really Christmassy in my inmost soul before." "I suppose," said Beth thoughtfully, "that it is because we've discovered for ourselves the old truth that it's more blessed to give than to receive. I've always known it in a way, but I never realized it before." "Blessing on Jean's Christmas inspiration," said Nellie. "But girls, let us try to make it an all-the-year-round inspiration, I say. We can bring a little bit of our own sunshine into Miss Allen's life as long as we live with her." "Amen to that," said Jean heartily. "Oh, listen, girls, the Christmas chimes." And all over the beautiful city was wafted the grand old message of peace on earth and goodwill to all the world. End of Christmas Inspiration.
Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1896 to 1901, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. A Christmas Mistake. "Tomorrow is Christmas," announced Teddy Grant exultantly, as he sat on the floor struggling manfully with a refractory bootlace that was knotted and tagless and stubbornly refused to go into the eyelets of Teddy's patched boots. "Ain't I glad, though! Hurrah!" His mother was washing the breakfast dishes in a dreary, listless sort of way. She looked tired and down-spirited. Ted's enthusiasm seemed to grate on her, for she answered sharply, "Christmas, indeed! I can't see that it is anything to rejoice over. Other people may be glad enough, but what with winter coming on, I'd sooner it was spring than Christmas. Mary Alice, do lift that child out of the ashes, and put its shoes and stockings on. Everything seems to be at 6s and 7s here this morning." Keith, the oldest boy, was coiled up on the sofa calmly working out some algebra problems, quite oblivious to the noise around him. But he looked up from his slate, with his pencil suspended above an obstinate equation, to declaim with a flourish. "Christmas comes but once a year, and then Mother wishes it wasn't here." "I don't, then," said Gordon, son number 2, who was preparing his own noon lunch of bread and molasses at the table, and making an atrocious mess of crumbs and sugary syrup over everything. "I know one thing to be thankful for, and that is that there'll be no school. We'll have a whole week of holidays." Gordon was noted for his aversion to school and his affection for holidays. "And we're going to have turkey for dinner," declared Teddy, getting up off the floor and rushing to secure his share of bread and molasses. "And cranberry sauce and pound cake, ain't we, Ma?" "No, you are not," said Mrs. Grant desperately, dropping the dishcloth and snatching the baby on her knee to wipe the crust of cinders and molasses from the chubby pink and white face. "You may as well know it now, children. I've kept it from you so far in hopes that something would turn up, but nothing has. We can't have any Christmas dinner tomorrow. We can't afford it. I've pinched and saved every way I could for the last month, hoping that I'd be able to get a turkey for you anyhow, but you'll have to do without it. There's that doctor's bill to pay, and a dozen other bills coming in, and people say they can't wait. I suppose they can't, but it's kind of hard, I must say." The little Grants stood with open mouths and horrified eyes. No turkey for Christmas! Was the world coming to an end? Wouldn't the government interfere if anyone ventured to dispense with a Christmas celebration? The gluttonous Teddy stuffed his fists into his eyes and lifted up his voice. Keith, who understood better than the others the look on his mother's face, took his blubbering young brother by the collar and marched him into the porch. The twins, seeing the summary proceeding, swallowed the outcries they had intended to make, although they couldn't keep a few big tears from running down their fat cheeks. Mrs. Grant looked pityingly at the disappointed faces about her. "Don't cry, children, you make me feel worse. We are not the only ones who will have to do without a Christmas turkey. We ought to be very thankful that we have anything to eat at all. I hate to disappoint you, but it can't be helped." "Never mind, Mother," said Keith comfortingly, relaxing his hold upon the porch door, whereupon it suddenly flew open and precipitated Teddy, who had been tugging at the handle, heels over head backwards. "We know you've done your best. It's been a hard year for you. Just wait, though. I'll soon be grown up, and then you and these greedy youngsters shall feast on turkey every day of the year. Hello, Teddy, have you got on your feet again? Mind, sir, no more blubbering." "When I'm a man," announced Teddy with dignity, "I'd just like to see you put me in the porch. And I mean to have turkey all the time, and I won't give you any either." "All right, you greedy small boy. Only take yourself off to school now, and let us hear no more squeaks out of you. Tramp, all of you, and give Mother a chance to get her work done." Mrs. Grant got up and fell to work at her dishes with a brighter face. "Well, we mustn't give in. Perhaps things will be better after a while. I'll make a famous bread pudding, and you can boil some molasses taffy and ask those little Smithsons next door to help you pull it. They won't whine for turkey, I'll be bound. I don't suppose they ever tasted such a thing in all their lives. If I could afford it, I'd have had all of them in to dinner with us. That sermon Mr. Evans preached last Sunday kind of stirred me up. He said we ought always to try to share our Christmas joy with some poor souls who had never learned the meaning of the word. I can't do as much as I'd like to. It was different when your father was alive." The noisy group grew silent, as they always did when their father was spoken of. He had died the year before, and since his death the little family had had a hard time. Keith, to hide his feelings, began to hector the rest. "Mary Alice, do hurry up. Here, you twin nuisances, get off to school. If you don't, you'll be late, and then the master will give you a whipping." "He won't," answered the irrepressible Teddy. "He never whips us. He doesn't. He stands us on the floor sometimes, though," he added, remembering the many times his own chubby legs had been seen to better advantage on the school platform. "That man," said Mrs. Grant, alluding to the teacher, "makes me nervous. He is the most abstracted creature I ever saw in my life. It is a wonder to me he doesn't walk straight into the river some day. You'll meet him meandering along the street, gazing into vacancy, and he'll never see you nor hear a word you say half the time." "Yesterday," said Gordon, chuckling over the remembrance, "he came in with a big piece of paper he'd picked up on the entry floor in one hand and his hat in the other, and he stuffed his hat into the coal scuttle and hung up the paper on a nail as grave as you please. Never knew the difference till Ned Slocum went and told him. He's always doing things like that." Keith had collected his books and now marched his brothers and sisters off to school. Left alone with the baby, Mrs. Grant betook herself to her work with a heavy heart. But a second interruption broke the progress of her dishwashing. "I declare," she said, with a surprised glance through the window, "if there isn't that absent-minded school-teacher coming through the yard! What can he want? Dear me, I do hope Teddy hasn't been cutting capers in school again." For the teacher's last call had been in October, and had been occasioned by the fact that the irrepressible Teddy would persist in going to school with his pockets filled with live crickets, and in driving them harnessed to strings up and down the aisle when the teacher's back was turned. All mild methods of punishment having failed, the teacher had called to talk it over with Mrs. Grant, with the happy result that Teddy's behavior had improved, in the matter of crickets at least. But it was about time for another outbreak. Teddy had been unnaturally good for too long a time. Poor Mrs. Grant feared that it was the calm before a storm, and it was with nervous haste that she went to the door and greeted the young teacher. He was a slight, pale, boyish-looking fellow, with an abstracted, musing look in his large dark eyes. Mrs. Grant noticed with amusement that he wore a white straw hat in spite of the season. His eyes were directed to her face with his usual unseeing gaze. "Just as though he was looking through me at something 1,000 miles away," said Mrs. Grant afterwards. "I believe he was, too. His body was right there on the step before me, but where his soul was is more than you or I or anybody can tell." "Good morning," he said absently. "I have just called on my way to school with a message from Mrs. Miller. She wants you all to come up and have Christmas dinner with her tomorrow." "For the land's sake!" said Mrs. Grant blankly. "I don't understand." To herself she thought, "I wish I dared take him and shake him to find if he's walking in his sleep or not." "You and all the children, every one," went on the teacher dreamily, as if he were reciting a lesson learned beforehand. "She told me to tell you to be sure and come. Shall I say that you will?" "Oh, yes, that is, I suppose, I don't know," said Mrs. Grant incoherently. "I never expected, yes, you may tell her we'll come," she concluded abruptly. "Thank you," said the abstracted messenger, gravely lifting his hat and looking squarely through Mrs. Grant into unknown regions. When he had gone, Mrs. Grant went in and sat down, laughing in a sort of hysterical way. "I wonder if it is all right. Could Cornelia really have told him? She must, I suppose, but it is enough to take one's breath." Mrs. Grant and Cornelia Miller were cousins, and had once been the closest of friends, but that was years ago, before some spiteful reports and ill-natured gossip had come between them, making only a little rift at first that soon widened into a chasm of coldness and alienation. Therefore, this invitation surprised Mrs. Grant greatly. Miss Cornelia was a maiden lady of certain years, with a comfortable bank account and a handsome, old-fashioned house on the hill behind the village. She always boarded the school teachers and looked after them maternally. She was an active church worker and a tower of strength to struggling ministers and their families. If Cornelia has seen fit at last to hold out the hand of reconciliation, I'm glad enough to take it. Dear knows, I've wanted to make up often enough, but I didn't think she ever would. We've both of us got too much pride and stubbornness. It's the Turner blood in us that does it. The Turners were all so set. But I mean to do my part now she has done hers." And Mrs. Grant made a final attack on the dishes with a beaming face. When the little Grants came home and heard the news, Teddy stood on his head to express his delight. The twins kissed each other, and Mary Alice and Gordon danced around the kitchen. Keith thought himself too big to betray any joy over a Christmas dinner, but he whistled while doing the chores until the bare welkin in the yard rang, and Teddy, in spite of unheard-of misdemeanors, was not collared off into the porch once. When the young teacher got home from school that evening, he found the yellow house full of all sorts of delectable odors. Miss Cornelia herself was concocting mince pies after the famous family recipe, while her ancient and faithful handmaiden, Hannah, was straining into molds the cranberry jelly. The open pantry door revealed a tempting array of Christmas delicacies. "Did you call and invite the Smithsons up to dinner as I told you?" asked Miss Cornelia anxiously. "Yes," was the dreamy response as he glided through the kitchen and vanished into the hall. Miss Cornelia crimped the edges of her pies delicately with a relieved air. "I made certain he'd forget it," she said. "You just have to watch him as if he were a mere child. Didn't I catch him yesterday starting off to school in his carpet slippers? And in spite of me, he got away today in that ridiculous summer hat. You'd better set that jelly in the out pantry to cool, Hannah. It looks good. We'll give those poor little Smithsons a feast for once in their lives, if they never get another." At this juncture the hall door flew open, and Mr. Palmer appeared on the threshold. He seemed considerably agitated, and for once his eyes had lost their look of space-searching. "Miss Miller, I am afraid I did make a mistake this morning. It has just dawned on me. I am almost sure that I called at Mrs. Grant's and invited her and her family instead of the Smithsons, and she said they would come." Miss Cornelia's face was a study. "Mr. Palmer," she said, flourishing her crimping fork tragically, "do you mean to say you went and invited Linda Grant here tomorrow? Linda Grant, of all the women in this world!" "I did," said the teacher with penitent wretchedness. "It was very careless of me. I am very sorry. What can I do? I'll go down and tell them I made a mistake if you like." "You can't do that," groaned Miss Cornelia, sitting down and wrinkling up her forehead in dire perplexity. "It would never do in the world. For pity's sake, let me think for a minute." Miss Cornelia did think, to good purpose evidently, for her forehead smoothed out as her meditations proceeded, and her face brightened. Then she got up briskly. "Well, you've done it, and no mistake. I don't know that I'm sorry, either. Anyhow, we'll leave it as it is. But you must go straight down now and invite the Smithsons, too. And for pity's sake, don't make any more mistakes." When he had gone, Miss Cornelia opened her heart to Hannah. "I never could have done it myself, never. The Turner is too strong in me. But I'm glad it's done. I've been wanting for years to make up with Linda. And now the chance has come, thanks to that blessed blundering boy, I mean to make the most of it. Mind, Hannah, you never whisper a word about its being a mistake. Linda must never know. Poor Linda! She's had a hard time. Hannah, we must make some more pies, and I must go straight down to the store and get some more Santa Claus stuff. I've only got enough to go around the Smithsons." When Mrs. Grant and her family arrived at the yellow house next morning, Miss Cornelia herself ran out bareheaded to meet them. The two women shook hands a little stiffly, And then a rill of long-repressed affection trickled out from some secret spring in Miss Cornelia's heart, and she kissed her new-found old friend tenderly. Linda returned the kiss warmly, and both felt that the old-time friendship was theirs again. The little Smithsons all came, and they and the little Grants sat down on the long bright dining room to a dinner that made history in their small lives, and was eaten over again in happy dreams for months. How those children did eat! And how beaming Miss Cornelia and grim-faced, soft-hearted Hannah, and even the absent-minded teacher himself, enjoyed watching them. After dinner, Miss Cornelia distributed among the delighted little souls the presents she had bought for them, and then turned them loose in the big shining kitchen to have a taffy pull, and they had it to their hearts' content. And as for the shocking, taffified state into which they got their own rosy faces and that once immaculate domain, well, as Miss Cornelia and Hannah never said one word about it, neither will I. The four women enjoyed the afternoon in their own way, and the schoolteacher buried himself in algebra to his own great satisfaction. When her guests went home in the starlit December dusk, Miss Cornelia walked part of the way with them and had a long confidential talk with Mrs. Grant. When she returned, it was to find Hannah groaning in and over the kitchen, and the schoolteacher dreamily trying to clean some molasses off his boots with the kitchen hairbrush. Long-suffering Miss Cornelia rescued her property and dispatched Mr. Palmer into the woodshed to find the shoe-brush. Then she sat down and laughed. "Hannah, what will become of that boy yet? There's no counting on what he'll do next. I don't know how he'll ever get through the world, I'm sure, but I'll look after him while he's here at least. I owe him a huge debt of gratitude for this Christmas blunder. What an awful mess this place is in. But, Hannah, did you ever in the world see anything so delightful as that little Tommy Smithson stuffing himself with plum cake, not to mention Teddy Grant? It did me good just to see them." End of A Christmas Mistake. Recording by Trisha G.
If you have a book lover or bibliophile in your life, then consider gifting them a premium membership. Our premium membership gives you access to book parties, watch parties, Discord access, and all our premium books, our premium audio, and occasionally video content, all for an entire year. Go to craftlit.gumroad.com. That's CRAFT as in Tom, LIT .gumroad, GUM as in Mary, ROAD as in dog.com, and give someone a premium membership, or go to craftlit.com/premium to get the membership for yourself.
Slowly fall the snowflakes, hang the holly high, bright its berries greeting.
Christmas Greetings by Lewis Carroll. From a fairy to a child. Lady dear, if fairies may for a moment lay aside cunning tricks and elfish play, 'tis at happy Christmas tide. We have heard the children say, gentle children whom we love, long ago on Christmas Day came a message from above. Still, as Christmas tide comes round, they remember it again, echoes still the joyful sound, peace on earth, goodwill to men. Yet the hearts must childlike be, where such heavenly guests abide, unto children in their glee, all the year is Christmas tide. Thus forgetting tricks and play, for a moment, lady dear, we would wish you, if we may, Merry Christmas, Glad New Year. Christmas, 1867.
Christmas Day by Hartley Coleridge. Was it a fancy, bred of vagrant guess, or well-remembered fact, that he was born when half the world was wintry and forlorn, in nature's utmost season of distress? And did the simple earth indeed confess its destitution and its craving need, wearing the white and penitential weed, meet symbol of judicial barrenness? So be it, for in truth 'tis ever so, that when the winter of the soul is bare, the seed of heaven at first begins to grow. peeping abroad in desert of despair. Full many a floweret, good and sweet and fair, is kindly wrapped in coverlet of snow.
A Christmas Barring Out by Stella C. Shutter. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. Bobby and Alice and Pink had hung their stockings by the living-room mantel, and though it was very, very early, they decided to go to bed. They always wanted to go to bed early on Christmas Eve. Morning seemed to come so much more quickly when they went to bed early. They wouldn't even wait for a story. They would just say good night to Grandma and go right to bed. "Why," exclaimed Grandma in surprise when they had explained their intentions to her, "you mustn't go to bed so soon. You'd be awake in the morning before daylight. Come in and visit with me a while, and I'll see if I can't think up a story to tell you the same as on other nights." So they went in and sat down on their stools in front of the fire. Grandma put on her spectacles, but instead of her knitting she took up her Bible. The children were very still while she read the story of the first Christmas, how in a stable in Bethlehem the baby Christ was born, and how an angel appeared to the shepherds who were watching their flocks and told them about the Saviour's birth, and then a host of angels came and praised God, saying, "Glory to God on high, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men," just as we sing today on Christmas. "I think," said Grandma, "that I will tell you tonight about a Christmas treat at our school. When I was a little girl we had a custom handed down from pioneer times called barring out. A few days before Christmas the teacher would arrive to find the schoolhouse door securely fastened. Before he was admitted, he would have to sign a paper promising to treat his pupils. In those days we didn't have much store candy, and we looked forward for weeks to the Christmas treat we got at school. You wouldn't think much of it today. 6 sticks of red and white striped candy apiece, wintergreen and sassafras and clove, and maybe one of horehound. My, but it tasted good to us. We didn't eat it all up at once either. No, indeed. But one year we didn't know whether to look for a treat or not. The teacher, a Mr. Hazen, was from Clayville, and he had been heard to say that he did not believe in barring out or in being forced to treat his pupils. Nevertheless, we all came early to school one morning and locked him out. While we all cried, "Treat! Treat!" at the tops of our voices, William Orbison opened the window a tiny bit and thrust out the paper they had prepared for the teacher to sign, but he refused to touch it. This was not alarming, as most all of the teachers stayed out for an hour or two just for fun. We played games and had a good time. But by time for morning intermission the older pupils had begun to get anxious. Could it be possible that the teacher really did not mean to treat? At noon he was still out, walking up and down the playground, clapping his hands together, stamping his feet, and rubbing his ears to keep warm. We were anxious in earnest now. The woodbox was empty, and the fire was getting low. There was no water in the water bucket, and some of the younger children were coaxing for drinks. No teacher in our recollection had ever refused to treat. There was an old rule that if the teacher persisted in refusing to treat, he was to be ducked in the nearest stream of water. We had heard of instances when this had been done, but no one wanted to try it. The older pupils stood around in frightened little groups, and some of the smaller children were crying openly, when the teacher knocked loudly on the door and asked that the paper be handed out to him. But the paper had disappeared. We searched all over the room, but it was nowhere to be found. Again the teacher knocked and asked rather impatiently for the paper. Then William Orbison sat down at his desk and hurriedly prepared another paper and handed it out the window to the teacher. He looked at it in a puzzled way for a little bit, smiled a queer smile, and without a word signed the paper and handed it back to William. Then he was admitted and took up books, but all afternoon he kept smiling to himself as if he knew a joke on someone. We felt uneasy, though we didn't know why. After school that evening my brother Truman asked William Orbison to let him see the paper the teacher had signed. When he read it he gave a long whistle of astonishment. And what do you think William had done? In the fuss and excitement of writing out the second paper he had omitted the word treat. The teacher had promised nothing. That explained his smiles. We were a disappointed lot of children, I can tell you. We shouldn't have any Christmas treat, for after the way the teacher had talked about treating, no one thought he would treat if he could help it, and here was a way out for him. The next day we were perfectly sure he did not intend to treat, for when William Orbison left out a word in his reading lesson, the teacher said, "Watch yourself, William. Leaving out words is getting to be quite a habit with you." Other years we could hardly wait till the day before Christmas. We wore our best clothes, and right after dinner we would speak pieces, have spelling and ciphering matches, sing songs, have our treat, and play games the rest of the afternoon. Lots of the older brothers and sisters would come to visit, and they would play with us, and the teacher would play too, and we would have lots of fun. But this year I should rather have stayed at home and watched the Christmas preparations at our house, for there wouldn't be much fun at school without any treat. It was a cold, windy morning, and Father took us to school in the sled. We had lessons in the morning as usual, and in the afternoon recitations and songs and a little play that the teacher had helped us get up. Truman gave Hamlet's soliloquy and did it very well too, and Charlie had a piece, but he forgot all but the first verse. We were so interested that we didn't think about the treat, and you can imagine how surprised we were when the teacher, instead of dismissing us, said that we would now have an unexpected but very welcome visitor. The door opened, and in came old Santa Claus with a white beard and a red coat, and on his back the biggest bag. You should have seen our eyes pop. Of course it wasn't the really, truly Santa Claus who comes in the night and fills the stockings. Oh no, this was just a pretend Santa. He put his bag down on the teacher's platform, and after he had made a little speech, he opened it up. And what do you suppose was in that bag? Candy. Cream candy and chocolate drops and clear candy, red and yellow, shaped like animals and horns and baskets, such candy as we had never seen before, a sack for each pupil. As we went up one by one, the smallest first, to get our treat, Santa asked each one of us to recite something for him. The smaller children knew verses out of their readers, and some of us recited the pieces we had said earlier in the afternoon. But how we all laughed when Longford Henlon, who was the tallest boy in school, couldn't think of anything to say but, "I had a little dog, his name was Jack, put him in the barn, he jumped through a crack." And now to bed, and go right to sleep. I've heard that if Santa Claus comes and finds children awake, he goes away and comes back later. That is, he means to come back later, but he has been known to get so busy he forgot to come back at all. So say your prayers and go to sleep.
Mary's Son is born. Christmas in the Olden Time by Sir Walter Scott. The damsel donned her kirtle sheen, the hall was dressed with holly green. Forth to the wood did merry men go, to gather in the mistletoe. Then opened wide the baron's hall, to vassal, tenant, serf and all. Power laid his rod of rule aside, and ceremony doffed his pride. The Eyre, with roses in his shoes, that night might village partner choose. The lord, under a gating share, the vulgar game of post and pair. All hailed with uncontrolled delight, and general voice, the happy night, that to the cottage as the crown brought tidings of salvation down. The fire with well-dried logs supplied went roaring up the chimney wide. The huge hall table's oaken face, scrubbed till it shone the day to grace, bore then upon its massive board no mark to part the squire and lord. Then was brought in the lusty brawn by an old blue-coated serving man. Then the grim boar's head frowned on high, crested with bay and rosemary. Well can the green-garbed ranger tell how, when and where the monster fell, what dogs before his death he tore, and all the baiting of the boar. The wassail round in good brown bowls, garnished with ribbon, blithely trolls. There the huge sirloin reeked, hard by plum porridge stood, and Christmas pie. Nor failed old Scotland to produce, at such high tide, her savoury goose. Then came the merry maskers in, and carols roared with blithesome din. If unmelodious was the song, it was a hearty note and strong. Who lists may in their mumming see traces of ancient mystery, while shirts supplied the masquerade, and smutted cheeks the visors made. But oh, what maskers richly dight can boast of bosoms half so light? England was merry England when old Christmas brought his sports again. 'Twas Christmas broached the mightiest ale, 'twas Christmas told the merriest tale. A Christmas gambol oft would cheer the poor man's heart through half the year.
Christmas Time by John Clare. Glad Christmas comes, and every hearth makes room to give him welcome now. E'en want will dry its tears in mirth, and crown him with a holly bough. Though tramping 'neath a winter sky o'er snowy paths and rimy stiles, the housewife sets her spinning by to bid him welcome with her smiles. Each house is swept the day before, and windows stuck with evergreens. The snow is besomed from the door, and comfort crowns the cottage scenes. Gilt holly with its thorny pricks, and yew and box with berries small, these deck the unused candlesticks and pictures hanging by the wall. Neighbours resume their annual cheer, wishing with smiles and spirits high, glad Christmas and a happy year to every morning passer-by. Milkmaids their Christmas journeys go, accompanied by a favoured swain, and children pace the crumpling snow to taste their granny's cake again. The shepherd, now no more afraid, since custom doth the chance bestow, starts up to kiss the giggling maid beneath the branch of mistletoe that 'neath each cottage beam is seen, with pearl-like berries shining gay, the shadow still of what hath been, which fashion yearly fades away. The singing waits, a merry throng, at early morn with simple skill, yet imitate the angels' song, and chaunt their Christmas ditty still. And mid the storm that dies and swells by fits, in hummings softly steals the music of the village bells, ringing around their merry peals. When this is past, a merry crew, bedecked in masks and ribbons gay, the morris dance their sports renew, and act their winter evening play. The clown turned king, for penny praise, storms with the actors' strut and swell, and harlequin, a laugh to raise, wears his hunchback and tinkling bell. And oft for pence and spicy ale, with winter nosegays pinned before, the wassail singer tells her tale, and drawls her Christmas carols o'er, while prentice boy with ruddy face and rime-bepowdered dancing locks, from door to door with happy face, runs round to claim his Christmas box. The block upon the fire is put, to sanction custom's old desires, and many a faggot's bands are cut for the old farmer's Christmas fires, where loud-tongued gladness joins the throng, and winter meets the warmth of May, till, feeling soon the heat too strong, he rubs his shins and draws away. While snows the window-panes bedim, the fire curls up a sunny charm, where, creaming o'er the pitcher's rim, the flowering ale is set to warm. Mirth, full of joy as summer bees, sits there its pleasures to impart, and children, 'tween their parents' knees, sing scraps of carols off by heart, and some, to view the winter weathers, climb up the window-seat with glee, likening the snow to falling feathers in fancy's infant ecstasy, laughing with superstitious love o'er visions wild that youth supplies, of people pulling geese above, and keeping Christmas in the skies. As though the homestead trees were dressed, in lieu of snow, with dancing leaves, as though the sun-dried martin's nest, instead of icicles, hung the eaves, the children hail the happy day, as if the snow were April's grass, and pleased, as 'neath the warmth of May, sport o'er the water froze to glass. Thou day of happy sound and mirth, that long with childish memory stays, how blest around the cottage hearth I met thee in my younger days, harping with rapture's dreaming joys on presents which thy coming found, the welcome sight of little toys, the Christmas gift of cousins round. About the glowing hearth at night, the harmless laugh and winter tale go round, while parting friends delight to toast each other o'er their ale. The cotter oft with quiet zeal will musing o'er his Bible lean, while in the dark the lovers steal to kiss and toy behind the screen. Old customs, oh, I love the sound, however simple they may be. Whate'er with time hath sanction found is welcome and is dear to me. Pride grows above simplicity, and spurns them from her haughty mind, and soon the poet's song will be the only refuge they can find.
Slowly fall the snowflakes, hang the holly high, bright its berries greeting,
Old Christmas by Mary Howitt. Now he who knows Old Christmas, he knows a wight of worth, for he's as good a fellow as any on the earth. He comes warm cloaked and coated, and buttoned to the chin, and ere he is anigh the door, we ope to let him in. He comes with voice most cordial, it does one good to hear, for all the little children he asks each passing year. His heart is warm and gladsome, not like your griping elves, who, with their wealth in plenty, think only of themselves. He tells us witty stories, he sings with might and main, we ne'er forget his visit till he comes back again. With laurel green and holly we make the house look gay, we know that it will please him, it was his ancient way. Oh, he's a rare old fellow, what gifts he gives away! There's not a lord in England could equal him today. Good luck unto old Christmas, long life now let us sing. He is more kind unto the poor than any crowned king.
Christmas in 1776 by Anne Hollingsworth Wharton. On Christmas Day in '76, our gallant troops with bayonets fixed to Trenton marched away. Children, have any of you ever thought of what little people like you were doing in this country more than 100 years ago, when the cruel tide of war swept over its bosom? From many homes the fathers were absent, fighting bravely for the liberty which we now enjoy, while the mothers no less valiantly struggled against hardships and discomforts in order to keep a home for their children, whom you only know as your great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers, dignified gentlemen and beautiful ladies, whose painted portraits hang upon the walls in some of your homes. Merry, romping children they were in those far-off times, yet their bright faces must have looked grave sometimes when they heard the grown people talk of the great things that were happening around them. Some of these little people never forgot the wonderful events of which they heard, and afterward related them to their children and grandchildren, which accounts for some of the interesting stories which you may still hear, if you are good children. The Christmas story that I have to tell you is about a boy and a girl who lived in Bordentown, New Jersey. The father of these children was a soldier in General Washington's army, which was encamped a few miles north of Trenton, on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. Bordentown, as you can see by looking on your map, if you have not hidden them all away for the holidays, is about 7 miles south of Trenton, where 1,500 Hessians and a troop of British light horse were holding the town. Thus you see that the British, in force, were between Washington's army and Bordentown, besides which there were some British and Hessian troops in the very town. All this seriously interfered with Captain Tracy's going home to eat his Christmas dinner with his wife and children. Kitty and Harry Tracy, who had not lived long enough to see many wars, could not imagine such a thing as Christmas without their father, and had busied themselves for weeks in making everything ready to have a merry time with him. Kitty, who loved to play quite as much as any frolicsome Kitty of today, had spent all her spare time in knitting a pair of thick woolen stockings, which seems a wonderful feat for a little girl only 8 years old to perform. Can you not see her sitting by the great chimney place, filled with its roaring, crackling logs, in her quaint, short-waisted dress, knitting away steadily, and puckering up her rosy, dimpled face over the strange twists and turns of that old stocking? I can see her, and I can also hear her sweet voice as she chatters away to her mother about how surprised Papa will be to find that his little girl can knit like a grown-up woman, while Harry spreads out on the hearth a goodly store of shell barks that he has gathered and is keeping for his share of the surprise. "What if he shouldn't come?" asked Harry suddenly. "Oh, he'll come. Papa never stays away on Christmas," said Kitty, looking up into her mother's face for an echo to her words. Instead, she sees something very like tears in her mother's eyes. "Oh, mamma, don't you think he'll come?" "He will come if he possibly can," said Mrs. Tracy, "and if he cannot, we will keep Christmas whenever dear Papa does come home." "It won't be half so nice," said Kitty. Nothing so nice as really Christmas, and how's Kriss Kringle going to know about it if we change the day? We'll let him come just the same, and if he brings anything for Papa, we can put it away for him." This plan still seemed a poor one to Miss Kitty, who went to her bed in a sober mood that night, and was heard telling her dear dolly, Martha Washington, that wars were miserable, and that when she married she should have a man who kept a candy shop for a husband, and not a soldier. "No, Martha, not even if he's as nice as Papa." As Martha made no objection to this little arrangement, being an obedient child, they were both soon fast asleep. The days of that cold winter of 1776 wore on. So cold it was that the suffering of the soldiers were great, their bleeding feet often leaving marks on the pure white snow over which they marched. As Christmas drew near, there was a feeling among the patriots that some blow was about to be struck, but what it was and from whence they knew not. And better than all, the British had no idea that any strong blow could come from Washington's army, weak and out of heart, as they thought, after being chased through Jersey for Cornwallis. Mrs. Tracy looked anxiously each day for news of the husband and father only a few miles away, yet so separated by the river and the enemy's troops that they seemed like 100. Christmas Eve came, but brought with it few rejoicings. The hearts of the people were too sad to be taken up with merrymaking, although the Hessian soldier in the town, good-natured Germans, who only fought the Americans because they were paid for it, gave themselves up to the feasting and revelry. "Shall we hang up our stockings?" asked Kitty, in rather a doleful voice. "Yes," said her mother. "Santa Claus won't forget you, I'm sure, although he has been kept pretty busy looking after the soldiers this winter." "Which side is he on?" asked Harry. "The right side, of course," said Mrs. Tracy, which was the most sensible answer she could possibly have given. So the stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. Two little rosy faces lay fast asleep upon the pillow when the good old soul came dashing over the roof about 1 o'clock, and after filling each stocking with red apples and leaving a cornucopia of sugar plums for each child, he turned for a moment to look at the sleeping faces, for St. Nicholas has a tender spot in his great big heart for a soldier's children. Then, remembering many other small folks waiting for him all over the land, he sprang up the chimney and was away in a trice. Santa Claus, in the form of Mrs. Tracy's farmer brother, brought her a splendid turkey. But because the Hessians were uncommonly fond of turkey, it came hidden under a load of wood. Harry was very fond of turkey too, as well as of all other good things. But when his mother said, "It's such a fine bird, it seems too bad to eat it without Father," Harry cried out, "Yes, keep it for Papa." And Kitty joining in the chorus, the vote was unanimous, and the turkey was hung away to await the return of the good soldier, although it seemed strange, as Kitty told Martha Washington, to have no Papa and no turkey on Christmas Day. The day passed and night came, cold with a steady fall of rain and sleet. Kitty prayed that her dear Papa might not be out in the storm, and that he might come home and wear his beautiful blue stockings. "And eat his turkey," said Harry's sleepy voice, after which they were soon in the land of dreams. Toward morning the good people in Bordentown were suddenly aroused by firing in the distance, which became more and more distinct as the day wore on. There was great excitement in the town. Men and women gathered together in little groups in the streets to wonder what it was all about, and neighbours came dropping into Mrs. Tracy's parlour all day long, one after the other, to say what they thought of the firing. In the evening there came a body of Hessians flying into the town to say that General Washington had surprised the British at Trenton early that morning and completely routed them, which so frightened the Hessians in Bordentown that they left without the slightest ceremony. It was a joyful hour to the good town people when the red jackets turned their backs on them, thinking every moment that the Patriot army would be after them. Indeed, it seemed as if wonders would never cease that day, for while rejoicings were still loud over the departure of the enemy, there came a knock at Mrs. Tracy's door, and while she was wondering whether she dared open it, it was pushed ajar, and a tall soldier entered. What a scream of delight greeted that soldier, and how Kitty and Harry danced about him and clung to his knees, while Mrs. Tracy drew him toward the warm blaze and helped him off with his damp cloak. Cold and tired Captain Tracy was, after a night's march in the streets and a day's fighting, but he was not too weary to smile at the dear faces around him, or to pat Kitty's head when she brought his warm stockings and would put them on the tired feet herself. Suddenly there was a sharp, quick bark outside the door. "What's that?" cried Harry. "Oh, I forgot. Open the door. Here, Fido, Fido." Into the room there sprang a beautiful little King Charles spaniel, white with tan spots and ears of the longest, softest, and silkiest. "What a little dear!" exclaimed Kitty. "Where did it come from?" "From the Battle of Trenton," said her father. "His poor master was shot. After the redcoats had turned their backs and I was hurrying along one of the streets where the fight had been the fiercest, I heard a low groan, and turning saw a British soldier lying among a number of slain. I raised his head. He begged for some water, which I brought him, and bending down my ear I heard him whisper, 'Dying, last battle, say a prayer.' He tried to follow me in the words of a prayer, and then taking my hand laid it on something soft and warm, nestling close up his breast. It was this little dog. The gentleman, for he was a real gentleman, gasped out, 'Take care of my poor Fido. Good night,' and was gone. It was as much as I could do to get the little creature away from his dead master. He clung to him as if he loved him better than life. You'll take care of him, won't you, children? I brought him home for you, for a Christmas present." "Pretty little Fido," said Kitty, taking the soft, curly creature in her arms. "I think it's the best present in the world, and tomorrow is to be real Christmas, because you are home, papa." "And we'll eat the turkey," said Harry, "and shell barks, lots of them, that I saved for you. What a good time we'll have! And oh, papa, don't go to war any more, but stay at home with mother and Kitty and Fido and me. What would become of our country if we should all do that, my little man?" It was a good day's work that we did this Christmas, getting the army all across the river so quickly and quietly that we surprised the enemy and gained a victory with the loss of few men. Thus it was that some of the good people of 1776 spent their Christmas, that their children and grandchildren might spend many of them as citizens of a free nation.
This holiday, celebrate with your favorite classic literature. Our Gumroad shop has over a dozen annotated classics, including The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, Sherlock Holmes, and more. Each of our premium audiobooks come with commentary and annotations, and sometimes even video. Visit craftlit.gumroad.com. That's CraftLit.gumroad, Gum as in Mary, ROAD as in dog.com, and buy them as a gift or buy them for yourself. Thank you for supporting us, and have a great one. Bye.
Christmas on Wheels by Willis Boyd Allen, read in English. 1. A railroad station in a large city is hardly an inviting spot at its best, but at the close of a cheerless, blustering December day, when biting draughts of wind come scurrying in at every open door, filling the air with a grey compound of dust and fine snow, when passengers tramp up and down the long platform, waiting impatiently for their trains, when newsboys wander about with disconsolate red faces, hands in pockets, and bundles of unsold papers under their ragged and shivering arms, when, in general, humankind presents itself as altogether a frozen, forlorn, discouraged, and hopeless race, condemned to be swept about on the nipping, dusty wind like Francesca and her lover at the rate of 30 miles an hour, then the station becomes positively unendurable. So thought Bob Estabrook as he paced to and fro in the Boston and Albany depot, travelling bag in hand, on just such a night as I have described. Beside him, locomotives puffed and plunged and backed on the shining rails as if they too felt compelled to trot up and down to keep themselves warm and in even tolerably good humour. "Just my luck," growled Bob, with a misanthropic glare at a loud-voiced family who were passing. "Christmas coming, 2 jolly Brighton parties, and an oratorio thrown up, and here I am, fired off to San Francisco. So much for being junior member of a law firm. Wonder what—" Here the ruffled current of his meditations ran plump against a rock, and as suddenly diverged from its former course. The rock was no less than a young person, who at that moment approached with a grey-haired man and inquired the way to the ticket office. "Just beyond the waiting room, on the right," replied Bob, pointing to the office, and lifting his hat courteously in response to the lady's question. He watched them with growing interest as they followed his directions and stood before the lighted window. The 2 silhouettes were decidedly out of the common. The voice, whose delicate tones still lingered pleasantly about Mr. Robert Estabrook's fastidious ears, was an individual voice as distinguishable from any other, he remembered, as was the owner's bright face, the little fur collar beneath it, the daintily gloved hands, and the pretty brown travelling suit. "Dignified old fellow," mused Bob irrelevantly, as the couple moved toward the train gates. "Probably her father. Perhaps, hullo! By George, they're going on my car!" With which breath of summer in his winter of discontent, the young man proceeded to finish his cigar, consult his watch, and, as the last warning bell rang, step upon the platform of the already moving Pullman. It must be admitted that as he entered he gave an expectant glance down the aisle of the car, but the sombre curtains hanging from ceiling to floor told no tales. Too sleepy to speculate, and too learned in the marvellous acoustic properties of a sleeping car to engage the porter in conversation on the subject, he found his berth, arranged himself for the night with the nonchalance of an old traveller, and, laying his head upon his vibrating atom of a pillow, was soon plunged into a dream at least 50 miles long. 2. It was snowing, and snowing hard. Moreover, it had been snowing all night and all the afternoon before. The wind rioted furiously over the broad Missouri plains, alternately building up huge castles of snow and throwing them down again like a fretful child, overtaking the belated teamster on his homeward journey, clutching him with its icy hand, and leaving him buried in a tomb spotless as the fairest marble. Howling, shrieking, racing madly to and fro, never out of breath, always the same tireless, pitiless, awful power. Rocks, fields, sometimes even forests, were blotted out of the landscape. A mere hyphen upon the broad white page lay the western-bound train, held fast by the soft but firm hand. The fires in the locomotives, there were 2 of them, had been suffered to go out, the fuel in the tenders was exhausted, and the great creatures waited silently together, left alone in the storm, while the snow drifted higher and higher upon their patient backs. When Bob had waked that morning to find the tempest more furious than ever, and the train stuck fast in a huge snowbank, his first thought was of dismay at the possible detention in the narrow limits of the Pullman, which seemed much colder than it had before. His next was to wonder how the change of fortune would affect Gertrude Raymond. Of course, he had long ago become acquainted with the brown travelling suit and fur collar. Of course, there had been numberless little services for him to perform for her and the old gentleman, who had indeed proved to be her father. Bob had already begun to dread the end of the journey. He had gone to his berth the night before, wishing that San Francisco were 10 days from Boston instead of 6. Providence having taken him at his word, and indicated that the journey would be of at least that duration, if not more, he was disposed, like no few of his fellow mortals, to grumble. Once more he became misanthropic. "There's Miss Raymond now," he growled to himself, knocking his head savagely against the upper berth in his attempt to look out through the frosty pane, "sitting over against the aisle day after day with her kid gloves and all that. Nice enough, of course," recalling one or two spirited conversations where hours had slipped by like minutes, "but confoundedly useless, like the rest of 'em. If she were like mother, now, there'd be no trouble. She'd take care of herself. But as it is, the whole car will be turned upside down for her to-day, for fear she'll freeze or starve or spoil her complexion or something." Here Bob turned an extremely cold shoulder on the window, and having performed a sort of horizontal toilette, emerged from his berth, his hair on end, and his face expressive of utter defiance to the world in general, and contempt of fashionable young ladies in particular. At that moment Miss Raymond appeared in the aisle, sweet and rosy as a June morning, her cheeks glowing and her eyes sparkling with fun. "Good morning, Mr. Estabrook," she said demurely, settling the fur collar about her neck. Bob endeavoured to look dignified, and was conscious of failure. "Good morning," he replied with some stiffness and a shiver which took him by surprise. It was cold, jumping out of that warm berth. "I understand we must stay, but don't let me detain you," she added with a sly glance at his hair. Bob turned and marched off solemnly to the masculine end of the car, washed in ice water, completed his toilette, and came back refreshed. Breakfast was formally served as usual, and then a council of war was held. Conductor, engineers, and brakemen being consulted, and inventories taken, it was found that, while food was abundant, the stock of wood in the bins would not last till noon. There were 12 railroad men and 35 passengers on board, some 20 of the latter being emigrants in a second class behind the 2 Pullmans. The little company, gathered in the snowbound car, looked blankly at each other, some of them instinctively drawing their wraps more tightly about their shoulders, as if they already felt the approaching chill. It was miles to the nearest station in either direction. Above, below, on all sides was the white blur of tumultuous, wind-lashed snow. The silence was broken pleasantly. Once more Bob felt the power of those clear, sweet tones. "The men must make up a party to hunt for wood," she said. "While you're gone, we women will do what we can for those who are left." The necessity for immediate action was evident, and without further words the council broke up, to obey her suggestion. A dozen men, looking like amateur Esquimaux, and floundering up to their armpits at the first step, started off through the drifts. One of the trainmen, who knew the line of the road thoroughly, was sure they must be near a certain clump of trees where plenty of wood could be obtained. Taking the precaution to move in single line, one of the engineers, a broad-shouldered 6-footer, leading the way, and steering by compass, they were soon out of sight. As they struck off at right angles to the track, Bob thought he recognized a face, pressed close to the pane and watching them anxiously, but he could not be sure. 2 hours later the men appeared once more, some staggering under huge logs, some with axes, some with bundles of lighter boughs for kindling. In another 5 minutes smoke was going up cheerily from the whole line of cars, for the trees had proved to be less than a quarter of a mile distant, and the supply would be plentiful before night. When Bob Estabrook stamped into his own car, hugging up a big armful of wood, he was a different-looking fellow from the trim young lawyer who was wont to stand before the jury seats in the Boston court-house. He had on a pair of immense blue yarn mittens loaned by a kindly brakeman, his face was scratched with refractory twigs, His eyebrows were frosted, his moustache an icy carrot. The average tramp might well have hesitated before acknowledging kinship with him. His eyes roved through the length of the car as it had that first night in the depot. She was not there. He was as anxious as a boy for her praise. "Guess I'll take it into the next car," he said apologetically to the nearest passengers. "There's more coming just behind." She was not in the second Pullman. Of course, she wasn't in the baggage car. Was it possible? He entered the third and last car, recoiling just a bit at the odor of crowded and unclean poverty which met him at the door. Sure enough, there she sat, his idle, fashionable type of inutility, with one frowsy child upon the seat beside her, two very rumpled-looking boys in front, and a baby with terracotta hair in her arms. Somehow the baby's hair against the fur collar didn't look so badly as you would expect, either. She seemed to be singing it to sleep, and kept on with her soft crooning as she glanced up over the tangled red locks at Snowy Bob and his armful of wood, with a look in her eyes that would have sent him cheerfully to Alaska for more, had there been need. A few seats off, I ought to say, her father was talking kindly and earnestly to a rough-looking man and his wife, the latter of whom wore the dear old gentleman's cloak. Fathers and daughters are apt to be pretty much alike in these things, you see. 3. With the cheerful heat of the fires, the kind offices of nearly all the well-dressed people to the poorer ones, for they were not slow, these kid-gloved Pullman passengers, to follow Miss Raymond's example, the day wore on quietly and not unpleasantly toward its close. Then some one suddenly remembered that it was Christmas Eve. "Dear me!" cried Miss Raymond, delightedly, reaching round the baby to clap her hands. "Let's have a Christmas party!" A few sighed and shook their heads as they thought of their own home firesides. One or two smiled indulgently on the small enthusiast. Several chimed in at once. Conductor and baggage master were consulted, and the spacious baggage car, specially engaged for the occasion, the originator of the scheme triumphantly announced. Preparations commenced without delay. All the young people put their heads together in one corner, and many were the explosions of laughter as the program grew. Trunks were visited by their owners and small articles abstracted therefrom to serve as gifts for the emigrants and trainmen, to whose particular entertainment the evening was by common consent to be devoted. Just as the lamps were lighted in the train, our hero, who had disappeared early in the afternoon, returned, dragging after him a small, stunted pine tree, which seemed to have strayed away from its native forests on purpose for the celebration. On being admitted to the grand hall, Bob further added to the decorations a few strings of a queer, mossy sort of evergreen. Hereupon a very young man with light eyebrows, who had hitherto been inconspicuous, suddenly appeared from the depths of a battered trunk, over the edge of which he had for some time been bent like a siphon, and with a beaming face produced a box of veritable tiny wax candles. He was on the road, he explained, for a large wholesale toy shop, and these were samples. He guessed he could make it all right with the firm. Of course, the affair was a great success. I have no space to tell of the sheltered walk that Bob constructed of rugs from car to car, of the beautified interior of the old baggage car, draped with shawls and brightened with bits of ribbon, of the mute wonder of the poor immigrants, a number of whom had but just arrived from Germany and could not speak a word of English, of their unbounded delight when the glistening tree was disclosed, and the cries of "Weihnachtsbaum! Weihnachtsbaum!" from their rumpled children, whose faces waked into a glow of blissful recollection at the sight. Ah, if you could have seen the pretty gifts the brave little pine, which all the managers agreed couldn't possibly have been used had it been an inch taller, The improvised tableau, wherein Bob successively personated an organ-grinder, a pug dog, and Hamlet, amid thunders of applause from the brakemen and engineers. Then the passengers sang a simple Christmas carol, Miss Raymond leading with her pure soprano, and Bob chiming in like the diapason of an organ. Just as the last words died away, a sudden hush came over the audience. Could it be an illusion, or did they hear the muffled but sweet notes of a church bell faintly sounding without? Tears came into the eyes of some of the roughest of the emigrants as they listened, and thought of a wee belfry somewhere in the fatherland, where the Christmas bells were calling to prayers that night. The sound of the bells ceased, and the merriment went on, while the young man, with eyebrows lighter than ever, but with radiant face, let himself quietly into the car unnoticed. It had been his own thought to creep out into the storm, clear away the snow from the nearest locomotive bell, and ring it while the gaiety was at its height. All this indeed there was, and more, but to Bob the joy and sweetness of the evening centred in one bright face. What mattered it if the wind roared and moaned about the lonely snow-drifted train, while he could look into those brown eyes and listen to that voice for whose every tone he was fast learning to watch? Well, the blockade was raised, and the long railroad trip finished at last. But 2 of its passengers, at least, have agreed to enter upon a still longer journey. 4. She says it all began when he came staggering in with his armful of wood and his blue mittens. And he? He doesn't care at all when it began. He only realizes the joy that has come to him, and believes that after a certain day next May it will be Christmas for him all the year round. End of Christmas on Wheels by Willis Boyd Allen.
"What makes the book so cross?" asked the youngest listener, who had for a few minutes, for lack of anything better to do, been paying some slight attention to the reading that was intended for her elders. It was a question which we had not been bright enough to ask. We had been plodding on with the vague idea that it was a delightful book. Certainly the subject was agreeable. The writer was taking us on a ramble through the less frequented parts of Italy. He had a fine descriptive power, and made us see the quiet hill towns, the old walls, the simple peasants, the white Umbrian cattle in the fields. It was just the sort of thing that should have brought peace to the soul. But it didn't. The author had the trick of rubbing his subject the wrong way. Everything he saw seemed to suggest something just the opposite. When every prospect pleased, he took offense at something that wasn't there. He was himself a favored man of leisure, and he could go where he pleased and stay as long as he liked. Instead of being content with a short, Pharisaic prayer of thanksgiving that he was not as other men, he turned to berate the other men, who in New York were at that very moment rushing up and down the crowded streets in the frantic haste to be rich. He treated their fault as his misfortune. Indeed, it was unfortunate that the thought of their haste should spoil the serenity of his contemplation. His fine sense for the precious in art led him to seek the untrodden ways. He indulged in bitter gibes at the poor taste of the crowd. In some faraway church, just as he was getting ready to enjoy a beautifully faded picture on the wall, he caught sight of a tourist. He was only a mild-mannered man with an apologetic air, as one who would say, "Let me look too, I mean no harm." It was a meek effort at appreciation, but to the gentleman who wrote the book it was an offense. Here was a spry from the crowd, an emissary of the modern. By and by the whole pack would be in full cry, and the lovely solitude would be no more. Then the author wandered off through the olives, where under the unclouded Italian sky he could see the long line of the Apennines, and there he meditated on the insufferable smoke of Sheffield and Pittsburgh. The young critic was right. The author was undoubtedly cross. In early childhood this sort of thing is well understood and called by its right name. When a small person starts the day in a contradictory mood and insists on taking everything by the wrong handle, he is not allowed to flatter himself that he is a superior person with a temperament, or a fine thinker with a gift for righteous indignation. He is simply set down as cross. It is presumed that he got up the wrong way, and he is advised to try again and see if he cannot do better. If he is fortunate enough to be thrown into the society of his contemporaries, he is subjected to a course of salutary discipline. No mercy is shown to the cross-patch. He cannot present his personal grievances to the judgment of his peers, for his peers refuse to listen. After a while he becomes conscious that his wrath defeats itself, as he hears the derisive couplet, "Johnny's mad and I am glad." What's the use of being unpleasant any longer if it only produces such unnatural gaiety in others? At last, as a matter of self-defense, he puts on the armor of good humor, which alone is able to protect him from the assaults of his adversaries. But when a person has grown up, and is able to express himself in literary language, he is freed from these wholesome restraints. He may indulge in peevishness to his heart's content, and it will be received as a sort of esoteric wisdom. For we are simple-minded creatures and prone to superstition. It is only a few thousand years since the alphabet was invented, and the printing press is still more recent. There is still a certain Delphic mystery about the printed page which imposes upon the imagination. When we sit down with a book, it is hard to realize that we are only conversing with a fellow being who may know little more about the subject in hand than we do, and who is attempting to convey to us not only his life philosophy, but also his aches and pains, his likes and dislikes, and the limitations of his own experience. When doleful sounds come from the oracle, we take it for granted that something is the matter with the universe, when all that has happened is that one estimable gentleman, on a particular morning, was out of sorts when he took pen in hand. At Christmas time, when we naturally want to be on good terms with our fellow men, and when our pursuit of happiness takes the unexpectedly genial form of plotting for their happiness, the disposition of our favorite writers becomes a matter of great importance to us. A surly, sour-tempered person, taking advantage of our confidence, can turn us against our best friends. If he has an acrid wit, he may make us ashamed of our highest enthusiasms. He may so picture human life as to make the message, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men," seem a mere mockery. I have a friend who has in him the making of a popular scientist, having an easy flow of extemporaneous theory, so that he is never closely confined to his facts. One of his theories is that pessimism is purely a literary disease, and that it can only be conveyed through the printed page. In having a single means of infection, it follows the analogy of malaria, which in many respects it resembles. No mosquito, no malaria, so no book, no pessimism. Of course, you must have a particular kind of mosquito, and he must have got the infection somewhere, but that is his concern, not yours. The important thing for you is that he is the middleman on whom you depend for the disease. In like manner, so my friend asserts, the writer is the middleman through whom the public gets its supply of pessimism. I am not prepared to give an unqualified assent to this theory, for I have known some people who were quite illiterate who held very gloomy views. At the same time, it seems to me there is something in it. When an unbookish individual is in the dumps, he's conscious of his own misery, but he does not attribute it to all the world. The evil is narrowly localized. He sees the dark side of things because he is so unluckily placed that he alone is visible, but he is quite ready to believe that there is a bright side somewhere. I remember several pleasant half-hours spent in front of a cabin on the top of a far western mountain. The proprietor of the cabin, who was known as Pat, had dwelt there in solitary happiness until an intruder came and settled nearby. There was incompatibility of temper, and a feud began. Henceforth Pat had a grievance, and when a sympathetic traveler passed by, he would pour out the story of his woes, for, like the wretched man of old, he meditated evil on his bed against his enemy. And yet, as I have said, the half-hours spent in listening to these tirades were not cheerless, and no bad effects followed. Pat never impressed me as being inclined to misanthropy. In fact, I think he might have been set down as one who loved his fellow men, always excepting the unlucky individual who lived next to him. He never imputed the sins of this particular person to all of humanity. There was always a sunny margin of good humor around the black object of his hate. In this respect, Pat was angry and sinned not. After listening to his vituperative eloquence, I would ride on in hopeful frame of mind. I had seen the worst and was prepared for something better. It was too bad that Pat and his neighbor did not get on better together, but this was an incident which did not shut out the fact that it was a fine day, and that some uncommonly nice people might live on the other side of the range. But if Pat had possessed a high degree of literary talent, and had written a book, I'm sure the impression would have been quite different. Two loveless souls living on top of a lonely mountain, with the pitiless stars shining down on their futile hate. What theme could be more dreary? After reading the first chapter, I should be miserable. This, I should murmur, is life. There are two symbolic figures, Pat and the other. The artist, with relentless sincerity, refuses to allow our attention to be distracted by the introduction of any characters unconnected with the sordid tragedy. Here is human nature, stripped of all its pleasant illusions. What a poor creature is man. Pat and his neighbor, having become characters in a book, are taken as symbols of humanity, just as the scholastic theologians argued in many learned volumes that Adam and Eve, being all that there were at the time, should be treated as all mankind, at least for purposes of reprobation. The author who is saddest when he writes takes us at a disadvantage. He may assert that he is only telling us the truth. If it is ugly, that is not his fault. He pictures to us the thing he sees and declares that if we could free ourselves from our sentimental preference for what is pleasing, we should praise him for his fidelity. In all this, the author is well within his rights. But if he prefers unmitigated gloom in his representations of life, we on our part have the right of not taking him too seriously. Speaking of disillusion, we too can play at that game. We must get over our too romantic attitude towards literature. We must not exaggerate the significance of what is presented to us and treat that which is of necessity partial as if it were universal. When we are presented with a poor and shabby world, peopled only with sordid self-seekers, we need not be unduly depressed. We take the thing for what it is, a fragment. We are not looking directly at the world, but only at so much of it as has been mirrored in one particular mind. The mirror is not very large, and there is an obvious flaw in it, which more or less distorts the image. Still, let us be thankful for what is set before us, and make allowance for the natural human limitations. In this way, one can read almost any sincere book, not only with profit, but with a certain degree of pleasure. Let us remember that only a very small amount of good literature falls within Shelley's definition of poetry as the record of the best and happiest moments of the happiest and best minds. For these rare outpourings of joyous, healthy life, we are duly thankful. They are to be received as gifts of the gods, but we must not expect too many of them. Even the best minds often leave no record of their happiest moments, while they become garrulous over what displeases them. The cave of Adullam has always been the most prolific literary center. Every man who has a grievance is fiercely impelled to self-expression. He is not content till his grievance is published to the unheeding world, and it is well that it is so. We should be in a bad way if it were not for these inspired Adullamites who prevent us from resting in slothful indifference to evil. Most writers of decided individuality are inclined by a more or less iconoclastic impulse. There's an old idol they want to smash, a conventional lie which they want to expose. It is the same impulse which moves almost every right-minded citizen, once or twice in his life, to write a letter of protest to the newspaper. Things are going wrong in the neighborhood, and he is impatient to set them right. There are enough real grievances, and the full expression of them is a public service. But the trouble is that anyone who develops a decided gift in that direction is in danger of becoming the victim of his own talent. Eloquent fault-finding becomes a mannerism. The original grievance loses its sharp outlines. As it were, it passes from the solid to the gaseous state. It becomes vast, pervasive, atmospheric. It is like the London fog, enveloping all objects and causing the eyes of those who peer through it to smart. This happened in the last generation to Carlyle and Ruskin, and to a certain degree to Matthew Arnold. Each had his group of enthusiastic disciples who responded eagerly to their master's call. They renounced shams or machine-made articles or middle-class Philistinism, as the case might be. They went in for sincerity, or Turner, or sweetness and light, with all the ardor of youthfulness and youthful neophytes, and it was good for them. But after a while they became, if not exactly weary in well-doing, at least a little weary of the unintermittent tirades against ill-doing. They were in the plight of the good Christian who goes to church every Sunday only to hear the parson rebuke the sins of the people who are not there. The man who dated in his moral awakening from Sartor Resartus began to find latter-day pamphlets wear on his nerves. It is good to be awakened, but one does not care to have the rising bell rung in his ears all day long. One must have a little ease, even in Zion. Ruskin had a real grievance, and so had Matthew Arnold. It is too bad that so much modern work is poorly done, and it is too bad that the middle-class Englishman has a number of limitations that are quite obvious to his candid friends, and that his American cousin is no better. But when all this has been granted, why should one talk as if everything were going to the dogs? Why not put a cheerful courage on as we work for better things? Even the Philistine has his good points, and perhaps may be led where he cannot be driven. At any rate, he is not likely to be improved by scolding. I'm beginning to feel the same way even about Ibsen. Time was when he had an uncanny power over my imagination. He had the wand of a disenchanter. Here, I said, is one who has the gift of showing us the thing as it is. There is not a single one of these characters whom we have not met. Their poor shifts at self-deceit are painfully familiar to us. In the company of this keen-eyed detective, we can follow human selfishness and cowardice through all their disguises. The emptiness of conventional respectabilities and pieties and the futility of the spasmodic attempts at heroism are obvious enough. It was an eclipse of my faith in human nature. The eclipse was never total, because the shadow of the book could not quite hide the thought of various men and women whom I had actually known. After a while I began to recover my spirits. Why should I be so depressed? This is a big world, and there is room in it for many embodiments of good and evil. There are all sorts of people, and the existence of the bad is no argument against the existence of quite another sort. Let us take realism in literature for what it is and no more. It is, at best, only a description of an infinitesimal bit of reality. The more minutely accurate it is, the more limited it must be in its field. You must not expect to get a comprehensive view through a high-powered microscope. The author is severely limited not only by his choice of a subject, but by his temperament and by his opportunities for observation. He is doing us a favor when he focuses our attention upon one special object and makes us see it clearly. It is when the realistic writer turns philosopher and begins to generalize that we must be on our guard against him. He is likely to use his characters as symbols, and the symbolism becomes oppressive. There are some businesses which ought not to be united. They hinder healthful competition and produce a hateful monopoly. Thus, in some states, the railroads that carried coal also went into the business of coal mining. This has been prohibited by law. It is held that the railroad, being a common carrier, must not be put into a position in which it will be tempted to discriminate in favor of its own products. For a similar reason, it may be argued that it is dangerous to allow the dramatist or novelist to furnish us with a philosophy of life. the chances are that instead of impartially fulfilling the duties of a common carrier, he will foist upon us his own goods and force us to draw conclusions from the samples of human nature he has in stock. I should not be willing to accept a philosophy of life even from so accomplished a person as Mr. Bernard Shaw. It is not because I doubt his cleverness in presenting what he sees, but because I have a suspicion that there are some very important things which he does not see, or which do not interest him. It is really much more satisfactory for each one to gather his life philosophy from his own experience, rather than from what he reads out of a book, or from what he sees on the stage. The harvest of a quiet eye is, after all, more satisfying than the occasional discoveries of the unquiet eye that seeks only the brilliantly novel. The inevitable discrepancy between the literary representations of life and life itself has been the cause of an ancient feud between teachers of morals and writers of fiction. Because of this, Plato would banish poets from his Republic, and the Puritans would exclude novelists and play actors from their conventicles. But it is curious to observe how the character of the complaints varies with the change in literary fashions. The argument of serious persons against works of fiction used to be that they put too many romantic ideas into the reader's head. This was the charge made by Mrs. Tabitha Tenney, one of the first of a long line of American novelists. She wrote a novel entitled Female Quixotism, exhibited in the romantic opinions and extravagant adventures of Dorcasina Sheldon. The work was addressed to all the Columbian young ladies who read novels and romances. To these young ladies, the solemn advice of Mrs. Tabitha Tenney was, "Don't." Miss Dorcasina was certainly a distressing example. At the age of 3 years, this child had the misfortune to lose an excellent mother, whose advice would have been pointed out to her the plain, rational path of life, and prevented her imagination from being filled with the airy delusions and visionary dreams of love and raptures, darts, fires, and flames, with which the indiscreet writers of that fascinating kind of book denominated novels fill the heads of artless young girls to their great injury and sometime to their utter ruin. Her father allowed her to indulge her fancy, never considering their dangerous tendency to a young, inexperienced female mind. The various calamities into which Miss Dorcasina Sheldon fell may be imagined by those who have not the patience to search for them upon the printed page. Her parting words to those who had the guardianship of female minds had great solemnity. "Withhold from their eyes the pernicious volumes, which, while they convey false ideas of life and inspire illusory expectations, will tend to keep them ignorant of everything worth knowing, and which, if they do not eventually render them miserable, may at least prevent them from becoming respectable. Suffer not their imaginations to be filled with ideas of happiness, particularly in the connubial state, which can never be realized." If Mrs. Tabitha Tenney were to come to life in our day, I think she would hardly feel like warning the Columbian young ladies against the effect of works of fiction in exaggerating the happiness of life in general, or of the connubial state in particular. The young ladies are much more in danger of having their spirits depressed by the painstaking representation of miseries they are never likely to experience. The gloomy views of the average human nature, which once were conscientiously expounded by painful preachers, are now taken up by painful playwrights and storytellers. Under the spell of powerful imaginations, it is quite possible to see this world as nothing but a vale of tears. Happily, there is always a way of escape for those who are quick-witted enough to think of it in time. When fiction offers us only arid actualities, we can flee from it into the romance of real life. I sympathize with a young philosopher of my acquaintance. He took great joy in a jack-o'-lantern. The ruddy countenance of the pumpkin was the very picture of geniality. Goodwill gleamed from the round eyes, and the mouth was one luminous smile. No wonder that he asked the privilege of taking it to bed with him. He shouted gleefully when it was left on the table. But when he was alone, Mr. Jack-o'-lantern assumed a more grimly realistic aspect. There was something sinister in the squint of his eye, and uncanny in the way his rubicund nose gleamed. On entering the room a little while after, I found it in darkness. "What has become of your jack-o'-lantern?" "He was making faces at me. I looked at him till I got most scared, so I just got up and blew him out." I commended my philosopher for his good sense. It is the way to do with jack-o'-lanterns when they become unmannerly. And I believe that is the best way to treat distressing works of the imagination, though I know that their authors, who take themselves solemnly, will resent this advice. We can't blow out a reality just because it happens to make us miserable. We must face it. It is a part of the discipline of life. But a book or a play has no such right to domineer over us. Our own imagination has the first rights in its own home. If some other person's imagination intrudes and makes faces, it is our privilege to blow it out.
David watched the locked-out fairy go forth into the dusk again. He had always supposed that fairies disappeared suddenly and mysteriously, but this was not so. The little grey, furry figure hopped slowly across the patch of white in front of the window, bobbed and frisked, pricked up the alert little ears and swung his bushy tail, after the fashion of any genuine squirrel, and then dove under the low-hanging boughs of the nearest evergreens. As he disappeared, David felt an arm on his shoulder and turned to blink wonderingly into the face of big Barney, bending over him and grinning. "Well, well, who'd have thought to catch the Sandman making his rounds afore supper? What sent you to sleep, laddie?" "Asleep?" David scoffed hotly at the accusation. "I was no more asleep than you are, Barney. Why, do you know what I've just seen? What's been right here this very minute?" Barney's grin broadened. "Well, maybe now it was the locked-out fairy," for this was the old joke between them. Little did Barney dream that this time he had not only touched upon the real truth, but he had actually gripped it by the scruff of the neck, as he would have put it himself. David looked wise. He was trying to make up his mind just how to tell the wonderful news when Barney's next words held his tongue and sent the news scuttling back to his memory. "And speaking of fairies, I was just asking Joanna, getting supper out yonder, did she mind the tale old Con the Tinker used to be telling back in the old country about his great Uncle Tage and the wee red cap? Did Joanna ever tell you now about the fairy's red cap?" David shook his head. "It serves as an easy way of travel for them. You might almost call it their private Pullman car." Barney chuckled. "You wait a minute, and I'll see is there time to tell the tale myself between now and supper." He was away to the kitchen, and back before David had much more than time enough to rub the gathering frost from the window pane and look out for a possible return of his fairy. Nothing was to be seen, however, but the snow and the trees and the trail of tiny footprints, and big Barney was beside him in the window nook again with a mysterious, knowledgeable look on his face. "Aye, there's time and light enough still in the west to see the tale through." He paused for an instant. "You know, laddie, over in Ireland they're not keeping Christmas the same as you do here. The poor, I mean. 'Tis generally the day after, St. Stephen's Day, though sometimes 'tis St. Stephen's Eve that they manage a bit of a feast and merry-making. Them that has little shares with them that has less, and afterward the neighbours gather about the turf fire for a story-telling. Aye, many's the strange tale you will hear over in Ireland on one of them nights. And here's the tale old Con the Tinker used for to be telling about his great Uncle Teague, the most close-fisted man in all of Enniskillen." And here again is the tale as Barney retold it, and David heard it, as he sat in the window nook of the lodge at dusk hour, just 7 days before Christmas. "It was the eve of St. Stephen, and Teig sat alone by his fire, with naught in his cupboard but a pinch of tea and a bare mixing of meal, and a heart inside of him as soft and warm as the ice on the bucket water outside the door. The turf was near burnt on the hearth, a handful of golden cinders left, just, and Teig took to counting them greedily on his fingers. 'There's 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, he laughed. "Faith, there be more bits of real gold hid under the loose clay in the corner." It was the truth, and it was the scraping and scrooching for the last piece that had left Teig's cupboard bare of a Christmas dinner. "Gold is better nor eating and drinking, and if you have naught to give, there'll be naught asked of ye." And he laughed again. He was thinking of the neighbours, and the doles of food and piggins of milk that would pass over their thresholds that night to the vagabonds and paupers who were sure to come begging. And on the heels of that thought followed another. Who would be giving old Sean his dinner? Sean lived a stone's throw from Teig, alone, in a wee tumble-in cabin, and for a score of years past Teig had stood on the doorstep of every Christmas Eve and, making a hollow of his two hands, had called across the road, "Hey there, Sean! Will you come over for a sup?" And Sean had reached for his crutches, there being but one leg to him, and had come. "Faith," said Teig, trying another laugh, "Sean can fast for once. 'Twill be all the same in a month's time." And he fell to thinking of the gold again. A knock came to the door. Teig pulled himself down in his chair where the shadow would cover him, and held his tongue. "Teig? Teig?" It was the widow O'Donnelly's voice. "If you're there, open your door. I've not got the pay for the sprigging this month, and the children are needing food." But Teig put the leash on his tongue, and never stirred till he heard the tramp of her feet going on to the next cabin. Then he saw to it that the door was tight barred. Another knock came, and it was a stranger's voice this time. "The other cabins are filled. Not one but has its hearth crowded. Will you take us in, the two of us? The wind bites mortal sharp. Not a morsel of food have we tasted this day. Master, will you take us in?" But Teig sat on, a-holding his tongue, and the tramp of the stranger's feet passed down the road. Others took their place, small feet, running. It was the miller's wee Cassie, and she called out to him as she went by. "Old Sean's watching for you. You'll not be forgetting him, will you, Teig?" And then the child broke into a song, sweet and clear as she passed down the road. "Listen, all ye, 'tis the feast of St. Stephen. Mind that ye keep it this holy even. Open your door and greet ye the stranger, for ye mind that the wee Lord had not but a manger. Feed ye the hungry and rest ye the weary. This ye must do for the sake of our Mary. 'Tis well that ye mind, ye who sit by the fire, that the Lord he was born in a dark and cold byre." Teig put his fingers deep in his ears. "A million murthering curses on them that won't let me be. Can't a man try to keep what is his without being pestered by them has only idled and wasted their days?" And then the strange thing happened. Hundreds and hundreds of wee lights began dancing outside the window, making the room bright, and hands of the clock began chasing each other round the dial, and the bolt of the door drew itself out. Slowly, without a creak or a cringe, the door opened, and in there trooped a crowd of the good people. Their wee green cloaks were folded close about them, and each carried a rush candle. Teig was filled with great wonderment entirely when he saw the fairies, but when they saw him, they laughed. "We're taking the loan of your cabin this night, Teig," said they. "You're the only man hereabouts with a empty hearth, and we're needing one." Without saying more, they bustled about the room making ready. They lengthened out the table and spread it and set it. More of the good people trooped in, bringing stools and food and drink. The pipers came last, and they sat themselves around the chimney-piece, a-blowing their chanters and trying the drones. The feasting began, and the pipers played, and never had Teig seen such a sight in his life. Suddenly, a wee man sang out, "Clip-clap, clip-clap, I wish I had my wee red cap." And out of the air there tumbled the neatest cap Teig had ever laid his two eyes on. The wee man clapped it on his head, crying, "I wish I was in Spain." and whist up the chimney he went, away out of sight. It happened just as I'm telling it. Another wee man called for his cap, and away he went after the first, and then another, until the room was empty, and Teig sat alone again. "By my soul," said Teig, "I'd like to travel like that myself. It's a grand saving of tickets and baggage, and you get to a place before you've had time to change your mind. Faith, there's no harm done if I try it." So he sang the fairy's rhyme, and out of the air dropped a wee cap for him. For a moment, the wonder had him, but the next he was clapping the cap on his head, crying, "Spain!" Then, whisht, up the chimney he went after the fairies, and before he had time to let out his breath, he was standing in the middle of Spain, and strangeness all about him. He was in a great city. The doorways of the houses were hung with flowers, and the air was warm and sweet with the smell of them. Torches burned along the streets. Sweetmeat sellers went about crying their wares, and on the steps of a cathedral crouched a crowd of beggars. "What's the meaning of that?" asked Teig of one of the fairies. "They're waiting for those that are hearing Mass. When they come out, they give half of what they have to those that have nothing, so that on this night of all the year there shall be no hunger and no cold." And then, far down the street came the sound of a child's voice, singing, "Listen all ye, 'tis the feast of St. Stephen. Mind that ye keep it this holy even." "Curse it," said Teig. "Can a song fly after ye?" And then he heard the fairies cry, "Holland!" And he cried, "Holland!" too. In one leap he was over France, and another over Belgium, and with the third he was standing by long ditches of water frozen fast, and over them glided hundreds upon hundreds of lads and maids. Outside each door stood a wee wooden shoe, empty. Teig saw scores of them as he looked down the ditch of a street. "What is the meaning of those shoes?" he asked the fairies. "Ye poor lad," answered the wee man next to him, "are ye not knowing anything? This is the gift night of the year, when every man gives to his neighbour." A child came to the window of one of the houses, and in her hand was a lighted candle. She was singing as she put the light down close to the glass, and Teig caught the words. "Open your door and greet ye the stranger, for ye mind that the wee Lord had not but a manger." "'Tis the devil's work!" cried Teig, and he set the red cap more firmly on his head. "I'm for another country." I cannot be telling you half the adventures Teig had that night, nor half the sights that he saw, but he passed by fields that held sheaves of grain for the birds, and doorsteps that held bowls of porridge for the wee creatures. He saw lighted trees, sparkling and heavy with gifts, and he stood outside the churches and watched the crowds pass in, bearing gifts to the Holy Mother and Child. At last, the fairies straightened their caps and cried, "Now for the great hall and the King of England's palace!" Whist! And away they went, and Teig went after them, and the first thing he knew, he was in London, not an arm's length from the King's throne. Oh, it was a grander sight than he had seen in any other country. The hall was filled entirely with lords and ladies, and the great doors were open for the poor and the homeless to come in and warm themselves by the King's fire and feast from the King's table. And many a hungry soul did the King serve with his own hands. Those that had anything to give gave it in return. It might be a bit of music played on a harp or a pipe, or it might be a dance or a song, but more often it was a wish, just for good luck and safekeeping. Teig was so taken up with the watching that he never heard the fairies when they wished themselves off. Moreover, he never saw the wee girl that was fed and went laughing away, but he heard a bit of her song as she passed through the window. Feed ye the hungry and rest ye the weary. This ye must do for the sake of our Mary. Then the anger had Tig. I'll stop your pestering tongue once and for all time. And, catching the cap from his head, he threw it after her. No sooner was the cap gone than every soul in the hall saw him. The next moment they were about him, catching at his coat and crying, Where's he from? What is he here? Bring him before the king. And Tig was dragged along by 100 hands to the throne where the king sat. He was stealing food, cried one. He was stealing the king's jewels, cried another. He looks evil, cried a third. Kill him! And in a moment all the voices took it up, and the hall rang with, Aye, kill him! Kill him! Tig's legs took to trembling, and fear put the leash on his tongue. But after a long silence he managed to whisper, I have done no evil to no one. No one. Maybe, said the king. But have you done good? Come, tell us, have you given aught to anyone this night? If you have, we will pardon ye. Not a word could Tig say. Fear tightened the leash, for he was knowing full well there was no good to him that night. Then ye must die, said the king. Will ye try hanging or beheading? Hanging, please, your majesty, said Tig. The guards came rushing up and carried him off, but as he was crossing the threshold of the hall, a thought sprang at him, and he held him. Your majesty, he called after him, will you grant me a last request? I will, said the king. Thank ye. There's a wee red cap that I'm a mortal fond of, and I lost it a while ago. If I could be hung with it on, I would hang a deal more comfortable. The cap was found and brought to Tig. Clip, clap for my wee red cap, I wish I was home, he sang. Up and over the heads of the dumbfounded guard he flew, and whisked, and away out of sight. When he opened his eyes again, he was sitting close by his own hearth, with the fire burnt low. The hands of the clock were still. The bolt was fixed firm in his door. The fairies' lights were gone, and the only bright thing was the candle burning in old Sean's cabin across the road. A running of feet sounded outside, and then the snatch of a song. "'Tis well that ye mind ye who sit by the fire, that the Lord he was born in a dark and cold briar." "Wait ye, whoever ye are!" And Tig was away to the corner, digging fast at the loose clay, as the terrier digs at a bone. He filled his hands full of the shining gold, then hurried to the door, unbarring it. The miller's wee Cassie stood there, peering at him out of the darkness. "Take those to the widow O'Donnelly, do you hear? And take the rest to the store. You tell Jamie to bring up all that he has that is eatable and drinkable. And say to the neighbours, you say, 'Tig's keeping the feast this night.' Hurry now." Tig stopped a moment on the threshold until the tramp of her feet had died away. Then he made a hollow of his two hands and called across the road, "Hey there, Sean! Will you come over for a sup?" "And hey there, the two of you, will you come out for a sup?" It was Joanna's cheery voice bringing David back from a strange country and stranger happenings. She stood in the open doorway, a lighted candle in her hand. "You'd hurry faster if you knew what I had outside for supper. What would a wee lad say now to a bit of real Irish currant bread, baked in the griddle, and a bowl of chicken broth with dumplings?"
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy what we do at CraftLit and want to listen to more of our audio, feel free to visit us at our Gumroad shop and check out all our premium annotated books. Charles Dickens's Bleak House, for example, has more than 40 hours worth of annotated audiobook. We are not joking. If this is something you're interested in, go to craftlit.gumroad.com. That's CRAFTLIT.gumroad, GUM as in Mary, ROAD as in dog.com to access our premium books or buy them as a gift. Happy holidays. If you enjoy what we do here on CraftLit, please don't forget to like and subscribe on iTunes. Give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button on YouTube. You can also support the show by subscribing to the CraftLit App Premium feed. You can check the link below for details. Your support helps keep CraftLit going strong, and we've got plenty of ways for you to get involved now. If you want more perks, you can head over to Patreon at patreon.com/CraftLit and become a patron of this art. You can also join our YouTube channel memberships for access to tons of premium books as bonuses, or you can support us at ko-fi.com/craftlit. And guess what? We've just relaunched our premium memberships over on craftlit.com. Go to craftlit.com/premium and check out all of the details there. Link is below as well. For a one-stop shop to all things CraftLit, please visit Linktree at linktr.ee/CraftLit channel. This is your go-to hub for all of our social media and more. They're all listed there for you. And I keep forgetting to mention, come join our Facebook group. It is full of the kindest, most creative makers and readers, and even some people who never really used to read. We've got them now. All right, that's it for now. Thank you. Take care of yourself. Have a great one. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.